Morning.
Morning.
Could you please state and spell your name for the court reporter, please?
Brandon Wardlaw, Wardlaw.
And where are you currently employed?
The Knoxville Police Department.
What is your title at the Knoxville Police Department?
Police officer.
And how long have you been employed there?
17 years.
And can you tell us what was your title back in September of 2019?
I was a violent crimes investigator.
And were you assigned to the case involving Miss Robin Howington?
I was the helper investigator with Investigator Riddle.
Okay, so is it fair to say that Investigator Riddle was the main or lead investigator, and then you were assisting him as needed throughout the investigation?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I know that we've already seen some interviews, so I'm not going to go back through all of that, but there are a couple of things specifically that I want to talk to you about, okay? So were you on the scene at Balsam Drive on the evening of September the 14th, 2019?
For initially just a small amount of time, and then I went to the hospital, and then later that night over into the morning, we went back to the scene. Okay,
so when you go to the hospital, do you arrive before Miss Howington gets there or after she gets there?
After.
And do you, at some point in time, come into contact with Miss Howington?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
At this point, can you tell us what her demeanor was like?
When I first made contact with her, she was...
Just rephrase the question. What did you observe about her?
What did you observe about Miss Howington at the hospital?
When I first made contact with her, she was in they usually call it a family room off of the emergency room by herself. And the officer was outside the door. She was sitting there and she wasn't crying or anything, just kind of sitting there real solemn.
And do you know if she had her cell phone with her?
Yes, ma'am, she did have her cell phone.
And at some point at UT Hospital, do you actually have to get her cell phone from her?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you tell the jury about that?
Initially, when she's in this room, and I probably should have taken her phone from her at that point, but I was worried about that she still had a 2-year-old. She needed to make sure that she got situated. And also I had advised her, is there anybody you can call to come and be with you, because this whole situation, all we're knowing is that her daughter's just been murdered. And also in telling her that, I said, we're probably going to need your phone because you called 911 from it, so there's going to be some evidence there we need to get. At this point, I go back to try to find the doctor to see what's going on with Destiny. When I come back, I'm approached by Officer Tucker, who was the officer that was standing outside the door, and he tells me that Miss Howington has tried to give her phone to someone in the restroom. So at that point, I go and I get the phone from Miss Howington.
Did you ask her whether or not she had attempted to give her phone to someone?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And what was her response?
She did.
Okay. And I am going to show you something. Do you recognize this envelope here?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And do you know what it contains?
Right here it says an iPhone 6.
And is that the same phone that you actually physically took from Miss Howington that night?
I would have to look at it to be sure.
Okay. Is there any sort of initials or anything on the back?
Looks like it says BT 81123.
Okay. Let's see. All right. And so once you took the phone, can you tell us what you did at that point? Like where you took it from there?
When I initially took the phone, I noticed that the screen was cracked on it and it was wet. So I took it, and because I didn't want to be handling a wet phone, I got paper towels until I could get a rubber glove to put it in. Once we left the hospital, I kept the phone in my possession. We went back to the 3rd floor where the offices were, and I actually found a empty paint bucket, and I can't remember exactly who, but I got somebody to go get me a bag of rice, and I put the phone in the rice in the paint bucket.
Okay. And so from there, did you then get the phone and introduce it into KPD's evidence?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so just tell us a little bit about how that procedure works when you take a physical piece of evidence and admit it into KPD's evidence locker.
The phone will have to be, you have to put it in an envelope and seal it, and then with the tape on it, so that way nobody's been in it after you've already sealed it. And there's also more paperwork you have to fill out to send in with the phone to deal with what we call the chain of custody, everybody who has touched the evidence from that point on.
Now, did you physically put the phone in the envelope and seal it?
No, ma'am.
And who was it that did that portion?
The phone was given to, since Investigator Riddle was the lead, the phone was given to him.
Okay.
Well, the paint bucket was given to him, and at some point, he took the phone and did what he needed to do with it.
Okay. And so you said that the phone was wet and cracked.
Yes, ma'am.
Had you observed the phone prior to receiving it from Ms. Howington?
I did not.
Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about when you encounter Ms. Howington at the hospital. Did you notice anything on her arms or hands that appeared like a reddish-brown substance?
No, ma'am. I didn't see anything on her that would have looked out of the ordinary or caused me any concern.
Did you see any on her dress?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And so were you physically in the room when the doctors were telling Ms. Howington about her daughter's condition?
Yes, ma'am.
Were you in the room when they told her that her daughter was deceased?
Yes, ma'am.
And can you describe what you observed at that point?
She went from the just like kind of solemn state to there was crying at that point. It wasn't like, I would say, typical in one of those situations where you tell a parent their child has died. We have it, I call it, oh Lord Jesus. A lot of times you tell a person that their child has died and they lose it. It wasn't one of those. It was still very like low-key somber, but she did cry at that point.
And so after you all leave the hospital, do you all then go back to interview Ms. Howington?
Yes, ma'am.
When you're doing investigations like this, is it typical that you interview victims or their family members pretty soon after a crime has been committed?
Yes, ma'am. And especially in this case, we would need to interview the only witness we had. And at that point, this was the only witness we had, so we would have to try to get as much information from that person as soon as possible so we could figure out which direction we need to start going with the investigation.
And so when you're at the hospital and going back to interview Ms. Howington, at that point in time, are you treating this like a murder investigation?
Yes, ma'am.
And why is that?
Because we don't know at this point. All we know is we have a dead 5-year-old. And if we treat it like anything else, there's a good possibility that we're going to miss stuff. So we have to treat it like it is the top of the food chain until we find like it's not. And that doesn't mean just because it falls under murder, we're still not going to treat it with importance. But when you have a murder of a 5-year-old, everything stops. And you're going to treat that like it is the most important thing that just has taken place.
Did you also believe that you potentially had a suspect at large?
Yes, ma'am.
And where did that information come from?
That was from the 911 call that Ms. Howington made, that she had said that there was a random black male that came in her house and shot her daughter.
Okay, and so before that 911 call, to your knowledge, Ms. Howington had not had any contact with the police?
I had not had any contact with her before then.